So I think this brings my introduction to an end, and I would like to proceed by introducing our first speaker for the day, Professor Stefano Brusoni, who is the Professor of Technology and Innovation Management and also a co-director of the EMBA program, a new joint EMBA program by ETH Zürich and the University of St.Gallen. Stefano's work focuses on the analysis of the obstacles to innovation and change. He also has a particular interest in neurosciences and their application in management. So I'm personally very curious to hear the insights he'll share today from his research and his conclusions. Also, as the topic is an important one, understanding change, I would like to mention that Stefano's path has not always been academic. Prior to his doctoral degree, he was also doing different jobs. And I think you're the first professor, Stefano, I know at least, who has worked as a firefighter in the 90s. So I think we can safely say you're a person who can change and has proven that you don't have this resistance maybe to change most of us do have. Can we hear each other? Stefano, hello.
Thank you very much for the very kind introduction. Indeed, in the list of my odd jobs before academia, having worked in the fire brigade is actually pretty high on the list. That's probably the item that people remember the most. And here I am. I can also show my face at this point. Hi, everyone. I think we're going to talk about stuff that I kind of experienced long ago in the fire brigade. And we spend a lot of time training to develop habits. Then you go out for some emergency and you have to throw away the habits immediately and improvise. I think this kind of transitions are still very much important in my research work and in my experience also as a lecturer. So if you are all ready, I will now share my screen. Let me see if that works. You see it now, hopefully.
Yes, you can.
Better. Let me move this part here. All right, can you see the slides? Yes? Okay, excellent. So again, many thanks for giving me this opportunity to talk about my little journey, which indeed started a long time ago doing very different things. I am professor here at ETH Zurich. It's an engineering school. Hence the joint executive program that Rumi just mentioned together with colleagues in ISG is a very exciting opportunity for us to really combine people with very different backgrounds to deliver, hopefully, our participants an integrated experience at the interface between management, leadership, and technology. What I would like to discuss with you today is a little bit of this journey, well, not the firefighter journey, but more the research journey that developed over time, over many years. In my case, trying to make sense of how people respond to change, what kind of attitude people have toward change, and how we can intervene on those attitudes through learning, education, and development. Part of the work I will talk about today is research-based. It does have a number of applications already happening. Part of it are applied in startups. The EdTech space is super active, and I've been involved in a few such endeavors. And we have already mentioned this joint executive MBA together with colleagues in St.Gallen. I'm not going to talk about these applications. Happy to take questions, of course. I will try to emphasize what are the design principles that we put into these applications. And these design principles derive from the research which is based on collaboration with colleagues in neurosciences. So, well, we all know the world is changing. We all are engaged in different conversations about the changes that are impacting everything we do in our daily life, in our professional life. A very important part of this discussion is about how we relate to this conversation. Do we see them as opportunities or rather as threats? You see here a couple of examples of very visible conversations in everything we do, on newspapers, in daily life, in professional lives. Now, climate change is more naturally referred to a discussion about possible threats. Digital transformation is seen more as a source of opportunities, but it could be the other way around. There are many startups active in the area connected to climate change, how to respond to it, how to slow it down, how to revert it ideally. And similarly, if you think about the digital transformation, there are plenty of opportunities, but also big discussions related to the threats that these kind of transformations are generating. If you think about the entry and exit from the list of the Fortune 500 over the past 15 years, you see a lot of changes and a lot of mobility. There are big conversations going on about how to upskill and reskill the workforce, or how to prepare university students today for jobs that right now don't yet exist. COVID-19 has widened and extended our perception of a leadership skill gap in terms of how we respond to unexpected events in a concerted, coordinated manner. Okay, to make sense of how we respond to this, I would propose that there are basically two ways of looking at it, and which are kind of in contradiction. And my job is in a way to reconcile this contradiction. Some of you might know this painting. It's a very famous one, a very progressive one, a very optimistic one, a painting that captured the optimism about the fact that people are willing and capable to change, that they are there to embrace change, that there might be obstacles, but they could be overcome. This painting is actually iconic. It's been replicated a large number of times, changing the characters a little bit. You see here and here, and finally here, you see more modern representation of the same principle. People are willing to embrace change and to move on. But at the same time, you find also in the biographies of people like Charles Kettering, a very famous inventor, whose work is behind a lot of instruments we use on a daily basis at home. Think about refrigerators, air conditioning systems, but also electrical systems in anything that move, like cars or trains, industrial painting processes. He was a very famous, very successful innovator in his time, not very optimistic, actually, about the willingness of people to embrace change. And I think this is a very important debate to keep in mind, because how we relate to change explains a lot of how we can help people to really face these phases of rapid transformation. So, do people like to change? This is the fundamental question, I think, at the basis of any effort to design any training, learning program that actually impact. So how do we answer this question? In many different ways. In my case, started long ago with a bunch of colleagues putting a sample of expert decision makers with several years of work experience in the R&D area, both as managers and entrepreneurs, into a brain scan, an fMRI machine. And we asked them to play a simple game that you see represented up here. We showed them 4 slot machines with 4 different colors. And we asked them to pick one 300 times. Each choice, they get a number, 61 in that case. And they know at the end of the game, they're going to be rewarded depending on the total payoff they get. They want to get the highest possible number every time they choose, basically. So in this case, the red machine gives us a 61. We have to choose whether 61 is good enough for us. And so we stay with the same machine, stability, convergent thinking, in my jargon, exploitation, or whether instead 61 is not satisfactory. So we change machine. We pick the yellow, hoping that the yellow machine will give us a better score. If we do this, we are exploring, we are diverging, we are trying out something new. And again, what you see here is a very simple operationalization of the dichotomy between stability and change, convergent and divergent thinking. In my jargon, behavioral sciences, we call it exploitation of a learning strategy versus the exploration of a new one. In the fMRI, we can see what happens in the brain 500 milliseconds before this choice is made. And what we find is pictures like this. First of all, we observe that the neurological systems activated when exploring are very different from the neurological systems activated when exploiting. So we cannot do these two things at the same time. We have to switch. What I would like to focus your attention on is on the results related to divergent thinking. First of all, you observe these 4 different main circuitries related to exploration. So these are the activations of people while changing, while exploring, okay? And what do we observe? We observe the activation of regions related to making prediction, establishing patterns. Why is this important? Because, well, the world is a very noisy place. We receive a lot of stimuli, a lot of signals. Some of them are actual signals, some of them are actual noise. And we have to disentangle which is which. So we need to be able to establish patterns, to understand in which direction change is needed. This is what the frontoparietal regions and the frontotemporal cortex in particular do. We also need to accept that change is risky. So every time we change something, we take a risk. It might work, there might be a high payoff, but we might as well lose. What the anterior cingulate cortex does is basically cost-benefit analysis. So two systems are related to our ability of making predictions, to understand what kind of change is needed, in which direction. And another activation is related to our ability of comparing cost and benefits. When these activations are strong, we make a prediction and we change. While we change, we also observe this activation of the anterior insula, which is a system related to emotional reactions, and in particular is related to negative emotions. So this is the sample of people that is changing slot machine. They made a prediction. They think the benefits outweigh the risks and the costs. They change, but they still don't like it. Okay, so we need this more rational, cold rationality kind of systems on top to inhibit a negative emotion. Negative emotions are very pervasive and powerful. Do note that when we start looking at what kind of change one is considering, an emotional general dislike that you see at the beginning of that slide there, that the change to an alternative, that is the activation of the insula, may generate even stronger negative emotions when we check for what kind of change one is implementing. So for example, we all are creatures of habits. We develop habits because the habits make us efficient. We take this decision faster, okay? But we also get used to them. And what another study shows is that when people abandon an established habit toward which they have developed a certain sense of attachment, they don't experience only dislike, they actually experience anxiety. So that is the backward-looking part of the analysis. We develop habits for very good reasons, and we get attached to them. Abandoning them is a big choice. At the same time, what matters too is not what we leave behind, the habit, but also what we are trying to do anew. If it is something very new, we experience on top an additional negative emotion, which is even more intense than anxiety often, which is fear. So when we have a discussion about change, we have to factor in the fact that on average, people really don't like to change. There are these negative emotions that can be kept under control by the activation of the frontoparietal regions, yes, but they're active, they're not forgotten. Now, are these very bad news? Well, not entirely. If you frame this in terms of the literature on neuroplasticity, which is a stream of research, very interesting and still very new, that tell us how the brain, in adults, by the way, not in children only, but how the brain in adults can evolve over time. We can learn new things. And the good news here are that these brain regions related to knowing what to change, when to change, in which direction, doing cost-benefit analysis, they're all based generally in plastic brain areas. So they can be improved upon over time through training, education and learning. And these are the good news. So in short, do people like to change? Not really. So people who are engaged in change processes, they do that because they have inhibited a whole range of negative emotions related to change. And these negative emotions are very natural, by the way. They're literally built in evolutionary terms in the human brain. So they're not bad, they exist and have to be dealt with somehow. Good news is that we can improve upon our attitude toward change. We can improve our abilities that enable us to inhibit these negative emotions, okay? And this ability is very important right now because there is obviously a big need to understand how we can train a new generation of leaders capable of integrating management and technology, capable of facing a whole range of incredible challenges that we have to deal with. Again, digital transformation, climate change, pandemics. I mean, the need for change is obvious, and so are the resistances to change, by the way. And that's why it's so important to understand how these resistances can be overcome, starting at the very individual level. Let me give you 3 ideas about how to go about this conversation on how to support people's effort to embrace change. So what are the design principles we can use to leverage the literature on neuroplasticity and what we know about the attitude of people toward change? So let me try with these 3 ideas. First of all, there is a discussion about transferability. Let me start from the bottom of the pyramid here. Okay, what neuroplasticity tells us is that people can change, yes, but it requires time and effort. We have to replace old habits to which we are attached with a new habit. Adults in particular learn mainly through iteration and repetition. It's not by telling people to do things differently that they actually change. It's by enabling people to actually try things out over time. That's why the work environment is such a powerful learning environment, by the way, because people spend a lot of time there and they have to repeat their tasks. They have to improve over time. And this element of repetition is crucially related to the neuroplasticity discussion of the brain. We have to create new habits. This is why I think it's very important to keep in mind that learning and development programs ought to be designed not starting with a discussion about content per se, but with the kind of skills, cognitive, social, emotional skills that people need to develop in order to inhibit their negative reactions to change, their own negative reactions and those of their colleagues. Now, in order to develop new habits, we have to try out new things, but we also have to abandon old habits. And as I told you earlier, well, we get attached to those, and it's difficult to get rid of them. They generate anxiety again. This is where the discussion about personalization becomes important. Again, this is not a discussion about personalizing contents. I appreciate that is important too, of course. It's really more about personalizing feedback. How to give people a continuous stream of constructive feedback that help them keep at bay anxiety. The anxiety which is generated by the effort of developing habits we are attached to. And the whole discussion about feedback mechanisms here has been a little bit, I think, underestimated in the whole discussion about learning and education, which, particularly in universities, is still very much framed as a discussion about contents. What do people need? Okay, that's important too. But what I'm suggesting here is that if we want to really build on what we know about the micro foundations of change and the reactions to change, we have to think more about the skills, the cognitive and emotional skills that people need to overcome negative responses to change. These are very transferable skills, by the way. And we have to think about the feedback mechanisms that can be deployed to keep people engaged in this discussion about change as they abandon old habits and slowly over time replace them with new habits. The third item that I haven't talked about so far, but I think is important to keep in mind, is about impact, or more precisely in this case, scalability. And this is where new digital technologies can become really, really useful to generate processes that are bottom-up, that are interactive in design principles, but also enable interaction among learners and teachers on a scale that was in the past unprecedented. I think this is a crucial issue, because if we manage to deal with the trade-off between these three different design principles, we can really design learning and development programs that enable people to select the skills they need to develop to become better leaders. They develop habits that they can share with others as they replace old habits, and they can do that at scale. The three items together, until a few years ago, it was really one of those situations. I mean, three good things, pick any two. I think now we are at the beginning of a phase of development where we could actually be able to reconcile the trade-offs between the three different criteria. So to sum it up, there is a need to understand in precise, micro-funded, actionable ways, why is it that people don't like change? There are very good reasons for it. Again, in evolutionary terms, that's a very rational kind of response in our brain. Nevertheless, the brain is a plastic place. We can devise methods and ways to leverage neuroplasticity so that people can abandon whole habits and develop new ones, and not only as individuals, but also as groups. To do so, I think the principles of transferability, personalization, and scalability can be used together to develop programs that can achieve impact at scale. On this one, thank you so much for your attention. Happy to take your questions. Later, you might meet my colleague Natalie Naveda also to ask more specific questions about the programs we're developing on the basis of these findings. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Stefano. This was really fascinating, and I'm sure made us think a lot. I already have a first question for you from one of our participants, Yuri, because you emphasized rightly on the need to develop new habits. And the question is how long it takes to develop a new habit.
That's likely okay, that depends a bit on the habit, clearly. But again, the brain is pretty fast. And again, remember that in your work environment, you use a lot of habits on a daily basis multiple times. So we're talking about days to kickstart the process and weeks to get it done. Obviously, it depends whether this is your own habit as an individual, or we're talking about something that a whole team has to change and adapt. But think about the habit of introducing short breaks in your daily routine, particularly in the switch to home working online, right? So a lot of us, I certainly did the mistake of putting one meeting after another. And then after 6 hours, I was there on my chair and I couldn't take it anymore. A change in habit there is introducing a 5-10 minute break in between each meeting that you can do very fast. By the way, those 5 minutes have a major recharging effect on your attention control systems that are related to this ability of understanding when change is needed. So that's fast. If you want to engage your whole team just in this habit change, then you need to set up a meeting and convince a larger number of people.
Yes, absolutely. I completely agree. And this goes a little bit into our next topic of changing workplace cultures. I know that you're also working with the startups, consulting. Is there something, traditionally, startups are considered more agile to introduce changes than classical companies. What can we learn from them? And are there things more traditional, established companies can apply, perhaps?
I think startups are supposed to be more agile, and certainly they are. I think startups are a very good environment to have a discussion about the importance of keeping something constant, though, because if you keep changing everything at the same time, then you really lose control of the direction of change. I think one thing startups are good at in terms of what they do internally, given their size, also in terms of some of the technologies that are being developed, is this discussion about feedback. Being a smaller organization, it's easier to get feedback on a continuous basis. And again, this continuous feedback is important to keep people engaged in the change process. Because if you give feedback to people once a semester, after the initial input, they'll revert back to the old habit instantaneously. If you give feedback in real time, so to speak, on the job, that actually is what keeps the process going. Of course, the challenge of a large organization is how do I do it? Because in that sense, size does not help. But again, there are ways by technological means to improve a little bit on this dimension too.
Okay, I have another quite interesting question. Do we have different dynamics if change is introduced to the team of male or to the teams of female employees? I suppose, let's say it's an engineering company or a hospital. Would it be the same approach or different aspects to watch out for?
Okay, so there is two answers. Yeah, one more general than the other. The general answer is that yes, diversity is a powerful engine for change. So there is pretty robust evidence, by the way, that people, irrespective of their gender, people who recognize diversity, that value diversity, that make an effort to put themselves in the shoes of a diverse person, are actually better at a win-win out, new solutions, new options. So there is that positive value. Clearly, diversity also has to be managed, because diversity can also generate conflicts. We have to be a little bit realistic here. And there is another strand of work here looking at the differential ability of teams in terms of their gender composition to deal with tensions. And it turns out that teams that are either gender-based and balanced, sorry, or all females are actually better at dealing with conflicts and tensions than all male teams. I'm sorry to report. Or maybe I'm happy to report again. Depends on the level of selfishness.
We express, women express themselves more and more often.
I think well, there is a beautiful paper. If anyone is interested, I can send a reference on Science, looking at this ability of managing a conversation, particularly the conversation turning points, when a conflict is about to emerge and it can be turned into something constructive or not constructive. Mm-hmm. That specific conversation point is managed by women way better than men.
Okay, interesting.
It's not so much the exposing the emotionality. That's not necessarily true. It's really managing the conversation and the difficult phases in a conversation.
Very interesting. Thank you for this. I have another question by Leila. Do you think the underlying technology to perform the tasks can help to develop new habits at individual and organizational level? And what would be your comment on the interaction between the technology and the development of the habits to perform the task?
Okay. It depends a little bit what you have in mind for technology. The shortcut answer is yes. For example, if you think about digital technologies, there is a whole class of digital technologies about interaction, think of Slack, for example, that potentially can actually help us not only perform our job in a more efficient manner, but also to get more frequent feedback. And again, feedback is important in order to keep the change habit routine kind of going. Now, we have to be careful here because feedback through technology can also be turned into an instrument of control. This is not what I'm talking about. So there is a big difference between control and feedback. So one has to be careful in terms of how the system is actually designed and used. But the potential is there actually to have a built-in process to generate peer-to-peer interaction so that peers can give each other's feedback along the way.
Absolutely, yes. And as we have learning and development professionals here today, you emphasized, you spoke quite a bit about developing new habits and fostering new habits. So does this mean that every learning and development program which is designed and implemented in an organization has to have this component, or is this where we start actually?
I think what is important to build in is this element of transferability. Mm-hmm. So one should design but that's what I try to do. Okay, so let me contain here the generality of my answer. What I try to think when I design a program here at university or one in the startup in which I'm involved or one of the companies I work with is what is that you want to be sure it is transferred to daily professional practice. And again, I really try very much to frame that in terms of skills, not so much in terms of content. Again, content is very important, but contents are changing super rapidly. The core leadership skills like emotional intelligence, like cognitive flexibility, critical thinking, this is likely to be more stable. So the challenge is always designing something that people can learn offline in a safe space just to try out the new thing. But as they learn that, they think ahead about how they're going to apply it when they go back to their job. I think it's very important to enable and push participants to think ahead during the program. So what am I going to change in my daily habits tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. when I'm back on my desk? That reflection, in my view, should be part of any development program, because otherwise people go back to their normal office space, their normal work environment, and they instantaneously go back, understandably, to the old habits. So what they're going to change, they should be part of a discussion, of a conversation in the development program itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And the same goes for executive education programs, I suppose. I know that you're launching a brand new program right now. How did you incorporate some of these insights? Perhaps you can give us an example or two.
Very quickly, again, here we had the benefit of a greenfield approach. So we decided to start from scratch. So we really started from the skills. So the core of the program is not my class in innovation management. The core of the program is the personal development plan. So a set of skills, cognitive, social, emotional skills that people need to become functional, transformational leaders. So again, emotional intelligence, cognitive flexibility, the ability of negotiating or conflict management, the conversation turning we are talking about, the ability of giving feedback in a constructive manner, by the way. So this is the core. On top of this core, we built a set of projects which are the safe spaces in which the participants will be able to test the skills as they develop them. And of course, they get ideas about what to do in the projects from the traditional classes they receive on specific content. So again, the content is there, but it's basically to give people the tools they can make experiments with. But what we are trying to transfer really is this set of skills that are going to be useful to them, whatever job they're going to be doing next.
Okay, and one last question. You touched a little bit on technology, and the question I have here from Charlie is, do you expect VR and AR to play a bigger role in the world of work in general, and L&D programs aimed at changing habits? How they can
I think that's a very good question too.
Yeah,
I think VR, I know only a little bit about this kind of technology, but again, this is potentially a very good way to bridge the learning and development environment with the work environment. Exactly because that's another way, if you like, to develop a richer sandbox, a richer safe space where people can make experiments in a more realistic way. So they could really try out something new in a virtual environment which somehow mirror the actual work environment. Because of course, making a mistake during a development program implies little cost. Making the same mistake in your real professional environment implies a very different cost. And VR, AR have the potential to kind of, again, bridge the gap a bit better than we can do today. I don't think that tech is already where it should be to really do it, but it is moving super fast.
It is indeed. And on this note, I would like to thank you for joining us today, for taking the time to share your insights, to share some parts of your research and to answer the questions. I believe you mentioned you will stay a little bit, so if somebody from the participants would like to ask you particular questions, they can reach you as well in the platform, in the